From the McCourtney Institute for Democracy and Penn State University, I'm Chris Beam.
I'm Candace Watt-Smith.
I'm Jenna Spinelli, and welcome to Democracy Works. This week, we are talking about Amazon, and our guest is Alec Mcgillis, a senior reporter for ProPublica and author of the book Fulfillment: Winning and Losing in One-Click America. And this book stood out to me because it talks about a lot of the things we already know about Amazon, but it also introduces some bigger questions about Amazon's relationship to the government and its workers, and just looks at them in a new way. So before we get to all that, Chris, why don't you start us off just by reminding us of some of the things that we already know about Amazon and how they sort of fit into the context of what we talk about on this show?
Yeah, okay. I mean, the first thing, I think the first thing we all know that we need to say is that Amazon is an incredibly successful business model and has grown exponentially in 20, 30 years. Last year, in 2020, Amazon hired almost 500,000 people. I mean, there's just nothing like that in human history. And, and they were just so well positioned for this pandemic and took advantage of it, and they give people what they want. And so they're very, very successful. On the other hand, the other thing that most of us know is that Amazon is not a great place to work. They have incredibly high turnover. 3% a week, 150% annually, which is twice as high as its peers. It was also cited by OSHA as being one of the dirty dozen as far as worker safety. They have timed bathroom breaks. A lot of times you don't have any interaction with your peers, and you're even fired by text. You're timed according to some algorithm in terms of how much you're expected to do an hour.
Amazon is our frenemy. It's the company that we love to hate, and it's also the company, and companies like it are the companies that Facebook, I think, is kind of a similar situation that we both wish were not there and also depend on heavily. And, the thing about Amazon and companies like Amazon, I think that's important to say, and companies like Amazon, is that their CEOs are some of the richest people alive, and their people who work for them are often people who are also on public assistance. It's important for us to kind of tie together these business practices with how there are ramifications for how our government runs, and even larger ramifications for how democracy runs. If people aren't well cared for, even, like after they work 40 hours a week, are they still able to pay for their children's food and supplies? But also, are they able to really participate in democracy? Do they have the time? Do they have the wherewithal?
And before Amazon, the frenemy, or maybe even more, less friend part of the enemy was Walmart, because Walmart came into these rural communities and almost single-handedly destroyed the main street, right? And Starbucks comes in, and everybody has a Starbucks, and so now many of these local coffee shops that have existed for decades are put out of business. I mean, I don't see that as a sign of corporate evil. People, no one put a gun to anybody's head and said, you must now shop at Walmart. It was because if you were going into town and here was this one-stop shop where you could get everything, and it was cheap, and people just chose that model. And Starbucks started because most of American coffee was not very good.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right on that. I think the issue, and I think what Alec's book really highlights, is that government helps large corporations do the things that they do. So, for example, there's no income tax in some states.
Right.
And so then that means that businesses are going to want to come there and they take advantage of that. Or that cities will, give all of these subsidies to these large corporations.
Right. And that is why it makes sense for us to talk about it in this context, in a context of democracy. The government is cowed at minimum and controlled at maximum by these same corporations. And so despite the fact that labor and people have power through unions and through democracy and through politics, in fact, they cannot use that power. They cannot employ that power because it's not a fair fight. And I think that is pretty fundamental in terms of what we are talking about here and what we are genuinely able to achieve through democratic politics.
All right. Well, I think that is, both of you provided some very important context here for the issues at stake. I think Alec will expand on these fundamental questions a lot more and fill in some of the details with the reporting from his book. So let's go now to the interview with Alec Mcgillis. Alec Mcgillis, welcome to Democracy Works. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
So your book, Fulfillment, is a fascinating look at how Amazon has impacted the institutions that comprise our democracy and also reshaped some of America's social fabric, perhaps. To set the stage for all of that, can you talk a little bit about Jeff Bezos's political philosophy and how that impacts the way that Amazon does business?
Sure. I mean, I think the best way to just describe him really is a kind of a classic libertarian, tech libertarian, and with a fairly extreme form of that, with very little regard, concern for sort of the nation as a whole, society as a whole, democracy as a whole. There was one kind of remarkable moment as I was reporting this book. I went to speak with Nick Hanauer, who is this early investor in Amazon, whose wealth increased greatly through that early investment, but has since turned on the company quite strongly. And I was meeting with him in his office way up overlooking Elliott Bay in Seattle, and a couple years ago, and it was just as Amazon had announced the top 20 finalists for its second headquarters, and that list included virtually none of the cities that could really have used a boost by getting that second headquarters. All these cities, in the middle of the country, struggling cities that had applied for the second headquarters, and it would have been a great opportunity for the company in one fell swoop to really kind of rebalance some of these economic disparities that we have around the country with that second headquarters, which is really kind of the main concern of my book, that regional inequality that Amazon has exacerbated. And they could have made such a big difference by putting the second headquarters in like a St. Louis or Detroit or Cleveland. And I asked Nick Hanauer about that and why they hadn't done that. And it wasn't even on the finalist list, and he started laughing kind of maniacally. And he said, "You don't understand Jeff Bezos at all, do you?" And I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "He doesn't care about that sort of thing at all. Like, that is simply not a concern to him. That kind of notion of what might be best for the country or society, it is of no concern. It's strictly what is best for the company's bottom line." So a very extreme form of that bottom line shareholder mentality. And that moment really stuck with me, and it's quoted at length in even more sort of color in the book.
You also spend some time in the book sort of contrasting that approach you're just describing with Amazon with kind of a previous era of industry, writing about, Bethlehem Steel and people like Carnegie and Rockefeller, who were, much has been written about sort of their pros and cons of who they were and how they approach business and philanthropy and whatnot. So they're certainly not saints, but I think that there is a contrast to be had between like their approach to the relationship between business, civil society, and the public good, and what we're seeing now with Amazon. Can you talk a little bit more about that contrast?
Sure. I mean, I think we have to be careful here, of course, because at one level, all philanthropy is not ideal, right? And it's really, to have this small handful of insanely wealthy men, and they're mostly men, deciding how to spend the zillions instead of paying the fair share of taxes, where we all as citizens through our elected government decide what we're going to invest in. That kind of large scale philanthropy is fundamentally flawed in that regard. And there's a I thought a really wonderful articulation of that in the book, in the chapter on Seattle, where Amazon had fought off a tax in Seattle that was going to pay for more housing and homelessness services in Seattle. And then after they successfully killed this new tax, they threw some fairly modest money, philanthropic dollars toward that cause. And a local activist said, I'm not impressed by this. This is not how it's supposed to work. But even if one then accepts philanthropy, large-scale philanthropy as a reality, it is striking the contrast between Bezos and the titans of the Gilded Age certainly is striking. That, I mean, there was a commentary on this week after Bezos took off for outer space, and the contrast between him going on his joyride, his 11-minute joyride, and the company that's been costing him, I guess, about $1 billion a year, and then all the kind of investments that were made by the Gilded Age plutocrats, all of the Carnegie libraries and all the rest. And a very, very stark contrast there. As you mentioned, Beth Steele. Actually, one of the striking things I found when I was doing my chapter on Bethlehem Steel, and its huge steel mill in Baltimore that is now a bunch of Amazon warehouses, was that that company actually, its leadership actually I found very reminiscent of Bezos in the extremity of their plutocracy. The head of that, Charles Schwab, was the head of the company back in the teens and 20s, and he had the largest mansion in New York City, then built for himself an entire French peasant village in Western Pennsylvania. The company strongly discouraged their executives against getting involved in local civic affairs. Just didn't see that as worth their time. And it reminded me very much of sort of how Amazon has existed in Seattle, where there's been a similar kind of weird kind of separation from the city, the civic life of that city and the company. The mayor of Seattle in the early, the second decade of the century, never met Jeff Bezos once, which is a pretty striking fact.
You also talk about the Seattle City Council being unable to really deal with some of these issues surrounding taxes and housing and homelessness that had sprung up in the wake of Amazon's expansion. I mean, it's what happened with the city council and just kind of that breakdown of really the governing structure not being equipped to deal with everything that Amazon brought to the city.
Yeah, it was just an incredible episode. I mean, this is in the spring of 2018, and the city has developed one of the very worst homelessness problems in the country, really basically just second only to the Bay Area. And you've got progressive members of the city council, along with activists who want to do something about this. They come up with the idea of a tax on the city's largest employers, notably Amazon, but also some others. And it's basically a per employee tax. And the company is not happy about it. Amazon's not happy about this, but manages to negotiate the size of the tax down quite a bit. They negotiate with the city's fairly centrist mayor, business-friendly mayor, and they get it down to the point where it's really just loose change for Amazon in the broader scheme of things. And so they agree to this compromise. The tax passes the city council. The mayor signs it into law, and just a day or two after the mayor signs it into law, the company starts funding a huge push to repeal the tax by referendum on that fall's ballot. spends lots of money on this repeal effort, and it's clearly resonating. There's not just because they're spending so much on it, but because the company manages to tap into this really kind of unpleasant strain, kind of toxic strain in the local politics. A city that's superficially super liberal, 92% vote against Trump in 2016, but a lot of voters who are not happy about the homelessness crisis, are not happy about the prospect of new shelters being built in their neighborhood or new affordable housing being built in their neighborhood, a real strong kind of NIMBY strain. And then also a real sense of protectiveness around Amazon, is this sense that, yes, Amazon is huge and kind of scary, and they've brought us all this traffic in town and made our city kind of crazy. But on the other hand, they're also the reason why my little arts and crafts bungalow that I got for $200,000 a decade or two ago is now worth $1 million. And do we really want to kill the golden goose? And yes, they're a big scary giant, but they're our giant. And so Amazon tapped into all that, and the city council saw that this referendum push had a lot of steam behind it, and they were very worried about it provoking kind of a broader kind of conservative reactionary backlash on that fall's ballot and other races. And they decided to repeal the very tax that they had passed just a month after they passed it. It was this really kind of humiliating moment for the council. All but 2 members of the council voted to repeal the tax.
And we, of course, see, cities across the country, bending over backwards, it seems, to both the HQ2 search, of course, but even just in competing for, other Amazon, warehouses or other facilities, that the kind of tech corridor, sort of their tech infrastructure. Is it just sort of a foregone conclusion at this point that, we're going to continue to see places across the country offering big tax breaks because of the jobs that Amazon can bring to their regions?
Well, I think it's important, first of all, to focus on what we're talking about in these situations. There's kind of 2 different levels of this. There was the unseemly sweepstakes for their second headquarters, which was this crazy bonanza that promised a real just huge prize of initially 50,000 jobs, 50,000 high-paid jobs, and just billions in investment in a whole new big corporate campus. And that ended up being won by already the wealthiest metro area in the country, Washington, D.C., and that all was revealed to have been just kind of a big joke, because they ended up going with the most obvious candidates in the end. But then there's this other much more prevalent game of the warehouses and the data centers, and where are they going to put those. And it has just been incredible to watch, just all these towns and cities throwing subsidies at the company for those. And it's incredible because the warehouse jobs, of course, are not high paying. The warehouses bring all sorts of additional burdens on public services, like all the trucks on the roads. The data centers barely employ anyone. They employ just a few dozen people per data center. And the subsidies are especially confounding because especially with the warehouses, the company really needs to have them just about everywhere now. They're so huge. We're buying so much stuff from them. They have the promise of 2 and now 1 day deliveries. They have to be everywhere. So it's not like if a given place says, no, we're not going to give you the subsidy, that they can just go to the next state over. No, they have to be where you are. Mm-hmm. And so you actually have more leverage than you realize. But nonetheless, they're just, yes, these communities keep throwing the subsidies at them. Just last month, I was speaking to the Dayton Rotary Club in Dayton, Ohio, a city that features very much in the book, and unbeknownst to me, the company was about to announce that they were building a new fulfillment center just outside Dayton at the airport there, and this one was going to be getting a whole new swath of subsidies from mainly from the state. state economic development agency. And so it just keeps going on and on and on. That said, I have seen just recently a few places where there's starting to be pushback. There's a fight going on now in Western Pennsylvania outside Pittsburgh. There's another one down south that I heard about recently. So there are some places where you have residents starting to realize, wake up to this problem, realize that it's not a good deal for all sorts of reasons, and bringing more scrutiny to this.
Yeah, that really is a fascinating story you tell about the employee who sort of works these, this progression of jobs that sort of seem to pay less and less, and also I think it seems to be more and more sort of demoralizing kind of work. I couldn't help but think about as I was reading some of those stories about the warehouse workers and whatnot, thinking about my grandmother who worked in a textile factory for most of her life, and it was hard, backbreaking work, but the sense I always got from her was that they were kind of in it together. They would help each other out and go out for breakfast after they finished the third shift and hang out on the weekends. And I don't want to overly romanticize that by any means, but it does seem again that Amazon makes some deliberate steps, as you describe, to seem to discourage that type of behavior, to really focus on individual worker performance. Can you talk about what some of those things are?
Sure. You describe it very well. That the shift in what the work sort of mass working class employment looks like now that we've moved from the mill and the factory to the warehouse, and I really try to bring that across most of all in this chapter on the steel mill in Baltimore. It used to be the biggest steel mill in the world, and is now now just this massive logistics hub with just all these different warehouses, including now they have 3 Amazon warehouses in this one business park. I can't even keep up with it. Another one's been opening up now, and so I focus on this one worker who worked at the steel mill for 30 years, and then after it went bankrupt, he went in his late 60s to work at Amazon driving a forklift, and his work at the steel mill was so dangerous, so strenuous. He got injured a couple times, but nonetheless, he so preferred it to the work at the warehouse because he get paid much more, of course. It was a union job, but he just found it so much more meaningful. He was actually making something. He was making steel, and he had all this camaraderie with his fellow workers. I met him actually at a luncheon for retirees, monthly luncheon that still happens every month, and all these guys get together still. And that just doesn't exist in the warehouses. I mean, it's just this incredibly atomized, isolating kind of work. You're all kind of scattered about at your different stations on the conveyor belt, or you're in a sense you're interacting more with robots than with each other. If you're a picker now, pickers used to roam the corridors looking for items, all the stuff that we demanded, and now you just stand there at the conveyor belt and the robot brings the stack of stuff to you, and you take the item out of the shelves and drop it in the box, and then comes another robot. So you're really kind of working with the robot at the behest of the robots. And no, there's very little opportunity for interaction. There's actually even less now during the pandemic, because one of the measures they took to try to reduce the spread of COVID was to take jobs that used to have a couple people working them together, like say loading a truck, and they turned those into one-person jobs. So what little interaction that did happen is even less likely now. There's another former worker at the steel mill that I spoke with recently, who still lives nearby, and he said it was so striking that when workers leave the warehouse now, they go screaming out of there at like high speeds. You can hear like the engines roaring, and they're just desperate to get the hell out of there and get home. And the company that owns this whole business park now has had to put in huge speed bumps to try to deal with this problem of the speeding. And it was such a contrast with back in the day when he would just roll out of work with his coworkers. They all knew each other. You'd roll into the bar or the diner, depending on the time of day. And I brought this up with another Amazon worker in New York recently, and he laughed. He said, "Yeah, there's no way I'm going to go have a beer with Joe after work. I don't even know who Joe is."
The other thing that I found fascinating was just the sheer scale of government contracts that Amazon has procured at the expense of small businesses in many places. What can you? How did that sort of start, and how has it expanded over time? In terms of how Amazon interacts with the federal government and maybe other organizations related to it, like schools, colleges, et cetera.
Sure. I mean, this is really kind of happening at a couple of different levels. At the federal level, Amazon has gotten just massive contracts mostly for the cloud. So it has this incredibly lucrative arm, Amazon Web Services, where all these data centers that are where Amazon's essentially offering companies and the government its servers, just to keep, so that you, the government or smaller business, don't have to deal with that on your own. So it's got massive contracts from the federal government for that. And, there was a big, huge one. It's $500 million, I think, from the CIA a few years ago. And they're still in the running now for this really big one, $10 billion contract from the Pentagon to put the entire Pentagon in the cloud. But then at sort of the more local level, Amazon has also gotten very much into the business of procurement, of government procurement, and because it recognizes just how much money is spent on that. All the stuff that local, state, and federal governments and school districts, all sorts of public sector entities spend on all of their supplies. Whether it's office supplies or just furniture, all the rest, and so Amazon has made a big push in that direction. And their basic pitch to say a local government, city government, or school district is, look, why don't you just buy your stuff from us direct from the website, just the way you would at home with all your personal stuff. It just, as you know, it's so easy, it's so convenient. And don't worry if you're worried about not supporting the local supplier, the local office supplier dealer, say the local Dunder Mifflin that you've been working with. You can still buy from them on Amazon. We'll have like a little marker that says local supplier. And then they go to the office supply company and they say, hey, look, your clients are all moving to Amazon. So why don't you start selling on Amazon too? It'll be fine. And you can sell to the whole world too. And what that leaves out, of course, is that Amazon now, as middleman, is going to be collecting a huge cut of that commerce. There used to be direct local commerce, and now Amazon's going to collect anywhere from 15 to 30% of that commerce, and it's going to eat deeply into that local business's margins, and that money is that so much of that revenue business is essentially going to be just kind of sucked out of the local community into Seattle, into Washington, into these insanely hyper-prosperous cities where so much of our wealth is now based. That is how this problem is happening. That is how these regional disparities are happening, and how we're ending up with this incredibly unhealthy, out-of-whack situation that is at root what the book is about, which is this incredibly unhealthy regional disparity where you have some cities that are just insanely expensive and have utter displacement and homelessness and loss of character, and then a whole bunch of other cities that are just really struggling and seeing their basic wealth and commerce being sucked out of them, and that procurement game is one part of that. I focus that tale in El Paso, Texas, in the book, but it's happening everywhere.
So as you said, this is sort of like a big existential problem facing the country. And I think about, in thinking about, what do we do about this? What can individuals do? I wonder if there's a parallel here to the argument that some people make about climate change, where yes, we as individuals can take action to reduce our, to drive less, to buy a plug-in car, to buy energy efficient appliances, et cetera, et cetera. We can all make decisions to buy less from Amazon, or perhaps not at all. But I wonder if that's kind of futile in light of some of these massive things that are happening on just such a much larger scale.
So I think there are a few things that we can do. I think of this kind of in three prongs. One prong is we've already kind of touched on, which is the workers. And so just, anything that one can do to to support them in their ongoing organizing fight, because that's going to be going on for years now. It's going to take a very long time. But that's one prong, the worker conditions in the warehouses. Second prong is, I think, probably a more promising one in the short term, is this whole fight now in Washington around antitrust. There's really a whole lot more momentum now, recognition around the fact that one reason that we've got this really unhealthy concentration of wealth in certain parts of this country and in our economy is that our economy has gotten so concentrated in certain companies, and that we're really back at sort of a Gilded Age moment with corporate concentration. And so that's an issue that can seem very abstract, and antitrust is such a sort of abstract kind of cold word, but I think for voters to really start thinking more about that issue as something that they prioritize and care about, the way they do healthcare or education or other kind of core issues, because there are going to be major fights around that in these next couple of years. And the Biden named to the Federal Trade Commission this young woman who, just a few years ago as a law student wrote this iconic paper on Amazon and monopoly. She's now the chairperson of the Federal Trade Commission at age 32. It's really pretty extraordinary. But then there's also a lot of legislation going through Congress now. There are going to be big fights over it about breaking up the companies, somehow reining them in. So as a citizen, to care about that fight, I think is another thing that we can do, and to vote on it. But then the third, is what you've touched on, is the consumer aspect. And I do believe we have agency in this regard. I've not been advocating a boycott, but the fact is that the reason the company got so vastly bigger and more powerful this past year, 40% increase in sales, $60 billion gain in Bezos's personal wealth, all these additional warehouses, stock almost doubling. That was all us. That was us. That was us embracing with extraordinary alacrity the one-click life this past year, arguably even in excess of what the public health conditions demanded. And so I do think it's important, if we care about all the things we've been talking about this hour, that we moderate that, and that we somehow we break out of that habit to some degree. It's not about cold turkey necessarily, but it's about moderation and about returning to the physical spaces around us, not just as shoppers and consumers, but going back to the theater, going back to the movies, going back to the restaurants, breaking out of that hunkered down, atomized laptop life, and where you have zero interaction whatsoever as a consumer. You're not even going to lift your head probably when the guy drops off your box on your doorstep. And so to break out of that, I think, is very important. I think we actually do have more impact in this regard even than in climate change, because there's something a bit more direct here. This really, it's us as consumers who have been driving the extraordinary growth of this company. We do, in fact, still have agency.
Yeah. So Alec, I know that many of our listeners are involved or passionate about grassroots causes and organizations on everything from ending gerrymandering to advocating for ranked choice voting, et cetera, et cetera. Are there organizations in that vein that exist or are cropping up around some of these issues related to Amazon we've been talking about?
Two groups that I would mention in this regard. One is a really pretty extraordinary group called the Institute for Local Self-Reliance that has been around for years now. And they are doing a lot of work in this whole realm on supporting local business, supporting local communities, and supporting local government, really. And so that's one to look at. And they are now part of a broader coalition that's sprung up just in the past couple of years that is basically, a broad anti-Amazon coalition that's called the Athena Coalition. And you can find out more about them online, Athena as in the goddess. And so those would be two places to start. But then there's also, I think, just generally, there are these local efforts that are springing up now around the the additional warehouses. So just to keep an eye out for those in your area, because there will be more warehouses coming. If we keep buying as much as we're buying from them, they're going to have to keep building more warehouses. So you're going to have more of these warehouse deals. So that's one more thing to look for on the horizon.
Right. Well, we will leave it there. Alec, thank you for your work on this topic. I highly encourage listeners to check out your book, Fulfillment, which we will link to in the show notes. And thank you for taking the time to join us today.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So, Candace, we talked about how Amazon is one of these major dramatic developments, incredibly successful, incredibly powerful, and how difficult it is to organize labor under any circumstances in the United States. I just want to maybe start by saying that it is still not great, but it is better now than it has been since Reagan for sure, and maybe since like LBJ, which goes back a long time, 60 years, 70 years. This has always been kind of a back and forth in American politics and American society. But, you get the sense that enough of these stories are leaking out into the public that, people are more open to the idea of not just helping workers in terms of bathroom breaks and efficiency demands, but also in terms of checking the power of organizations like Amazon.
Yeah, I mean, ostensibly public opinion matters, but it's, policy is going to matter too. And how many states are now right to work states?
Right.
I think also local dynamics matter so much here. So thinking about, for example, a lot of, here I am in North Carolina, we're all like cheering for people in Alabama to get a union, but we don't live there and we're not within that space and that town navigating the situation there, which on the one hand, from the Amazon side, right, there's reports of intimidation. Amazon has been, reported to ensure that its workers don't have a sense of social cohesion. They barely know each other. And then there's the issue of what is the alternative for good work in that space, for decent paid jobs in that area. And so that also matters, that if Amazon is the best that you have, are you going to do anything that you think is going to go against it?
It reminds me of the situation that Alec talked about with regards to Seattle, an incredibly progressive area. But when it came down to Amazon saying, well, if you do this, if you let in if we change these standards and bring in these new housing ideas, you might lose some of this incredible real estate windfall that you've received, in part because of the role of Amazon in the community. And so this very progressive place said, well, maybe we don't want that so much, just because, self-interest is an incredibly powerful thing.
If I'm not mistaken, Alec calls them superficially progressive. Insofar, right, like you're saying, is that they're kind of like, hey, we should have fairness and we should have egalitarianism, but we also want to have our very high return on our home investments. And, it does make for strange bedfellows.
As you were talking, I was thinking about, that what you were describing is something, again, that is fundamental to our democratic politics. And that is this bifurcation associated with class and with urban rural. And my goodness, this sounds so much like what just happened with why we had a 20-year war in Afghanistan. Because the people who were there were no, a lot of people like us didn't know anybody who was in that war and didn't have reason to think about that war. And we're very happy to say, thank you for your service.
Yeah.
But when it became, when there was some issue of more, if their effort or if the issue required more effort on their part, they were kind of like, yeah, no, I think I'm good. And so there is this, kind of damning assessment of elites, people like us, in terms of how much we really are willing to walk the walk.
Just to go back to this thing about regional inequality and rural and urban, I think it's a point worth just kind of illuminating a bit more, because, and I'm not making an economic anxiety argument around Trump, but I do think that there's something to be said about what happens when opportunities are clustered in certain areas and there's no opportunity in other areas. How people respond to that in their kind of everyday life, right? How people respond to unemployment, poverty. It's almost, right, like people respond as anybody would respond across racial groups, right? And what that does to democracy. That people who, that when opportunities are clustered in some areas and devoid in other areas, that is also going to have political ramifications.
And it's not something that that these areas would be bending over backwards to get if it were not for the fact that there were very few other opportunities out there to get.
Right.
But I do want to say that I think it's something, I just want to reiterate something I mentioned before about how I just think this labor just needs to up its game here. This is not a lunch bucket manufacturing union job that needs organizing here. It's distinctive, it's different, and their corporate enemy is very, very smart.
Well, okay. Just to be sure that there is some calibrating of our timescales that we might need to do here, right? A failure in Bessemer on the first go round is not a failure, right? I mean, these organizing labor happens over years, not right. in a couple of months or even in a year or two, right? These kind of changes often take a long time.
No, I absolutely agree with that. I just think that, it's unlikely that the climate of opportunity is going to be much better than it is right now for American labor. And so now is the time for them to grasp this very difficult challenge and try to move it forward. Do you agree with that?
No.
Why not?
I don't think that most Americans are ready to give up whatever small goodies they're going to get as consumers when the rubber hits the road. That is a cultural change that has to happen among Americans, that we are willing to give up something for ourselves for the greater good. We should all be more mindful of where we're shopping and the decisions that we're making, the people that we interact with who do the labor that helps us get our day going, right, and moving. And that would be a major change, I think, even for us as individuals, just on a day-to-day basis, to be more conscientious about those things.
Democracy makes demands on us as citizens and as consumers, and we all can do better at that, and we can all benefit from a reminder that that is the case.
And that I agree with.
Knew we'd get there sooner or later. McGillis's book is really chock full of a lot of really infuriating stories, but it is also really interesting in terms of kind of accounting of where we are as a nation right now. And if what we just said is true, then that's the kind of thing that all of us need, and that we should consider ourselves in his debt for having given us. For Democracy Works, I'm Chris Beam.
And I'm Candace Watts-Smith. Thanks for listening.
Democracy Works is a collaboration between the McCourtney Institute for Democracy at Penn State and WPSU, Central Pennsylvania's NPR station. Andy Grant is our producer, and our editors are Jen Bortz, Chris Kugler, and Mark Stitzer. Editorial review by Emily Reddy. If you liked what you heard today, please consider leaving us a rating or review on Apple Podcasts. It helps other people find the show. Democracy Works is a proud member of the Democracy Group, a network of podcasts focused on democracy, civic engagement, and civil discourse. Learn more at democracygroup.org. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week.
I'm Lee C. Camp, host of the Tokens podcast. We dare to do theology in public. A whole lot of folks still care a whole lot about faith and the traditions that form us, but are looking for hospitable and alternative approaches. If that describes you, then come join us on the Tokens podcast, where we discuss culture and politics, science and religion, music and poetry, and the pursuit of human flourishing. Listen on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or our website at tokenshow.com.